producing more oil here can have an impact on gasoline prices somewhat, depending on
Mm,
how what the producers choose to do with it. But overall, the costs, and again, it's not just about producing more anywhere. What the
mm,
companies want is to produce more without regulation. So the cost to society are dramatically higher when you don't have regulation because that's when you get the pollution that makes people
mm.
sick. That's when you get the greenhouse gas emissions that worsen the climate crisis. That's when you get inequality that worsens the economy. So the overall hits to the economy are much worse.
Hello and welcome to Eric McElroy's American Exchange with me, Eric McElroy. That's how that works. Once again, I'm dialing across the pond from England to America to find out what is happening in my home country. And we are now 2 weeks into Trump 2.0, and woo, it's just calm. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Not to worry. Um, We have a fantastic guest this week, Antonia Juhas. She is a leading energy, climate, and environmental justice reporter and author and an investigative journalist for climate justice and environmental justice. Really interesting work that she's done. And she writes about that extensively, both for Rolling Stone and other publications, and also is the author of numerous books. The latest one is called Black Tide, which is about oil spills and how they're not good. I think is probably how I would sum that up. That's probably, I'm sure there's a little bit more detail in there than that. But really, really interesting to discuss with her because she's been reporting it from places of electoral interest as well. Because of course, the environment is important. I'm, looking at the political aspects of these things also. And she wrote one fascinating article about what things were going on in North Carolina, how the Biden administration, Biden-Harris, had done things to help North Carolina from a climate perspective, and how Trump will undermine all of those things, and yet he won the state. So we talked about that at length. We talked about how Trump is already started to do things to undermine environmental changes and safety, the lies behind drill, baby drill, and all of that, and how the poorest in America are going to be impacted by the actions his administration is going to take. And they shouldn't be surprised because these are the things he said he was going to do all along. Oh, and we also talk about that hand gesture by a certain Elon Musk. So it was great to meet Antonia and talk to her. Really interesting perspective and great ideas and very informed, obviously, about environmental issues. And I learned a lot from this conversation. So enjoy it. Check her out with Rolling Stone and also on her website. We'll put it all in the description and her book Black Tide as well. But please enjoy Antonia Juhas. Oh, and if you're watching this on YouTube, as always, please do subscribe to the channel. It is growing. We are getting there. And check out our previous conversations as well. We're also posting up some of the backlog of previous chats that weren't already on YouTube, going back a little while because it's so fascinating to dial back over the last years that we've done the podcast. And I have comedy clips on there as well. So check that all out. But in the meantime, please enjoy Antonia. I'm excited to welcome to the podcast a brand new guest, Antonia. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming on. As you know, this is me kind of dialing across the pond to see how things are going in my home country, which I do love, even after almost a quarter of a century. But we're 2 weeks into Trump 2.0. So I just want to start off, first off, how's it going? How you
Um,
feeling first, I suppose, before we get into the politics? How are you feeling?
yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show. And as we were chatting before we started, I woke up this morning to a terrible plane crash in Washington, D.C., where I live. 64
Mm,
people have died. A crash with a airplane and a Black Hawk helicopter. And that's horrible. And unfortunately, it's a horrible event that just is part of a cascade of horrible events. It's hard to stop and focus in on anything. These last 2 weeks um, have been exactly what the Trump team wanted them to be. It's shock and awe. That's their tactic. That's their
yeah.
intent. We're supposed to be shocked, and we are. It's very, very, very hard. It's a very, very hard place to be. It's like, how do you describe being both um, constantly moving and frozen in place at the same time. That's what it feels like. I feel emotionally stunted and, professionally trying to stay on top of everything. But even though we know that it's a tactic, the shock and awe is a tactic, it has real world implications. So they are
Mm,
also implementing real policy with real implications that has the ability to kill people. And we are trying to stay on top of that as journalists, and as people. And it's
mm,
very, very, very hard.
yeah. I mean, I know because I've talked to people who report in the White House and the fact that Biden wasn't as successful as we wanted him to be and that kind of thing. But it does already feel like 2 weeks of Trump is a year of Biden. I mean, it's just so much, so fast, it's so intense.
Yeah, I just don't even think it's possible to compare them. Um, the Biden administration was definitely, well, there's lots of pieces to talk about the Biden administration. And of course, we're in this moment. We're all already deeply stressed from, COVID, economic crisis, the war in Gaza, the election, uh, the and now what started. And so during the Biden administration, on the issues that I work on directly,
Mm,
climate, environmental justice, um, the environment, it was the most successful administration in US history in tackling those goals. There were lots of problems, things that we
mm,
wanted them to do more of and better, and things that we wanted them to do less of. Um, but even when you look at the war in Gaza, even when you look at the policies that I work on, there's no comparison to what the Trump administration is already doing. And that is
mm,
because the Trump administration has the only respect that the Trump administration has for government is how government can service its members and those who support it,
yeah.
period. Like that's it. Otherwise, it's I don't know like the right word is because we one of the things that was very strange with this election is that when people were polled, many people who voted for Trump said that they were voting for him because they didn't believe what he said he was going to do. And so that also meant that we who were journalists who were covering the campaign and saying, this is what he's saying he's going to do, this is what
Yeah.
he did last time, believe him. It made the
Mm,
public also not believe us. They thought that we were being hyperbolic. They thought that
yeah.
Kamala Harris was being hyperbolic by calling him a fascist. Um, and so it actually, when we were saying this is what he says he's going to do, this is what he did, this is what he plans to do, the public actually then trusted the media even less because they
Mm,
didn't believe that Trump was going to do what said he was going to do. So
yeah.
he's doing what he said he was going to do and worse because they're better at it this time. But there's also just a callousness and a meanness to it
Mm,
that I don't think, even as someone who spent a lot of time reading Project 2025 and studying the people who are going to be in this administration and studying the past administration, I anticipated the level of callousness and sort of brutality to the implementation of their policies, cutting off funding from the federal government. That's crazy,
yeah.
but it happened. Um, and and they still stand by it. They pulled back a memo that implemented that they had used implementing cutting off funding from the federal government, but then in a press conference said, but but the policies still stand. And so
Mm,
people still don't know what does that mean.
yeah.
So it's a lot.
Already, only 2 weeks in, and I know a lot of your focus on your journalism is on environmental issues. So what have they already done so far to attack those issues?
Yeah, so I look at this from a holistic perspective, which is climate, environmental justice, the environment, public health, the
Mm,
economy, all these pieces come together, but sort of I frame it within a picture of, I would say, climate and environmental justice in particular. And the Trump administration's platform coming in had just three key pieces, number two of which was energy. And Trump immediately launched a whole slew of executive orders within the first 24 hours of being in office. Many of them were about energy.
Yep.
And he declared a national energy emergency and put forward a whole bunch of executive orders that the intent of which is basically to remove as many restrictions as possible on the fossil fuel industry, to allow the fossil fuel industry to operate where it wants, when it wants, with as few restrictions as possible, with as few limitations as possible, and declaring a national energy emergency from the perspective of there not being enough freedom for fossil fuels. Um, the United States is currently the largest producer of oil and gas in the world. That is based on policies put in place by Trump in the last
Mm.
administration, coming to fruition at the end of his administration, basically continuing through the Biden administration to this point today.
Mhm.
Um, what what Trump is trying to do is basically eliminate all of those regulations and oversight that protect, that first seek to try and transition us off of fossil fuels, but
Mm.
also while they're being used, limit their impact, protecting, trying to implement regulations that reduce the harm to public health, to equity, to injustice, to the climate as we
Mm.
transition off of fossil fuels. Because the only way to address the climate crisis is to stop uh, the rapid transition off of fossil fuels is the only way to do that, and all the subsequent harms associated with it. And Trump has put forward executive orders and policies to try and remove as many of those guardrails as possible and open up a free-for-all for the industry.
But I mean, how do you, if we're already first in the world at producing oil, how do you become more first? I mean, I know Trump always does things bigger, better, badder. If it's first in the universe, I mean, what is it just that he wants to, I mean, because the problem is, I had a friend who voted for Trump, I think, because he said he's going to make energy prices lower. He's going to allow us more oil. I was like, well, yeah, Trump might open some floodgates of oil, but then there's different types of oil that's produced in America, and it's a refinery issue, and it's more complex than that. And as far as I barely know about this, and I know you know all about it. But then also this, the Saudis and OPEC, they don't want oil cheaper. So if Trump just floods the market, OPEC's not going to just go, okay, yeah, we want to make less money too, because it's not set just by us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right, 100%. So actually what I think there's a couple pieces here. So Trump did a bunch of things. One was also to pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord
Yeah.
and to eliminate, I think perhaps even more importantly, US funding the US and the world agreed at the last international climate negotiations to significantly increase to $300 billion funding to help low income and struggling countries transition off of fossil fuels and adapt to the climate crisis. So the
Right.
US is out of that and is not putting any money up to that, whereas Biden
Mm.
put up $11 billion in 2024 to that
Wow.
process. The US will now be out of that role completely. That was part of signaling and part of a continuation again from the first Trump administration, where Trump has aligned himself very tightly
Mm.
with Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and
Yeah.
Vladimir Putin of Russia, creating a triad of countries that want to maintain fossil fuels as a dominant resource. This is
Yeah.
critically important in every level to these three countries. So Trump is aligned with Saudi Arabia. It doesn't mean that he can tell the Saudis what to do because he tried to at the World Economic Forum and they don't abide by what he does. Instead,
Yeah.
he's inviting more investment from the Saudis into the United States, $1 trillion worth of investment in fossil fuels.
Mm.
What Trump is trying to do, the the US oil industry isn't about to significantly necessarily increase production in the United States. What's happening right now is we're already, as I said, the largest gas producer in the world. The
Mm.
US is exporting huge amounts of that gas, including to Europe.
Yep.
The increased production in gas has not lowered prices. Instead, it's increased prices because more
Mm.
of the product is being exported. So home heating is more expensive than it was before
Right.
because we're producing more. Oil, US producers will sell and refine that oil on a global market wherever will make them the most money. They
Yeah.
will sell oil in the United States at the price that makes them money. So producing more oil here can have an impact on gasoline prices somewhat, depending on
Mm,
how what the producers choose to do with it. But overall, the costs, and again, it's not just about producing more anywhere. What the
yeah.
companies want is to produce more without regulation. So the costs to society are dramatically higher when you don't have regulation because that's when you get the pollution that makes people
Mm,
sick. That's when you get the greenhouse gas emissions that worsen the climate crisis. That's when you get inequality that worsens the economy. So the overall hits to the economy are much worse the more we are dependent and reliant on fossil fuels than when we are engaged in the transition. And
mm,
so, I would say to your friend who voted for Trump,
mm.
um, they did a very successful job, I would say, really, of conning a lot of Americans to believe, one, that they weren't going to do what they said they were going to do on the things that Americans didn't like, and that
Yeah.
they would do the things that they said they were going to do, like reduce the cost of energy. I don't believe that's going to be the case because also Trump, in addition to increasing fossil fuels, passed an executive order to ban wind energy. He has
Mm,
some pet peeve against wind. So if we're
yeah.
having an energy emergency, wouldn't you want to make use of all of your resources like the wind? But instead, no.
Yeah.
So it's not about addressing. I agree that the United States has an energy emergency, and it's an energy emergency that is based on our dependence to fossil fuels, which is
Mm,
creating inequality, a lack of health, and climate crises. And what Trump is doing is moving us aggressively in the wrong direction. And anyone who lives in any place that's been hit by extreme weather now knows that you don't want more of that. You want to do
yeah.
whatever you can to reduce that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I know you've reported on is North Carolina and what's happened there with Hurricane Helene, and that the Biden administration, the money that they put through the various legislation that they passed, was helping places like North Carolina, recover from previous hurricanes and invest in a future, which would be, fight this climate crisis. And yet, as the hurricane happened and the politics of that happened, Trump won the state. Trump scared people into thinking that FEMA was out to get them, and that were stories of people who were not signing up for assistance from the organization that's meant to give them assistance because of various conspiracy theories that went out there. I mean, when the reality is, you've got Biden-Harris administration that wants to be reelected has helped you, and the lie is that here's this other guy who's doing fuck all and is making it so you're not getting the assistance that exists. I mean, I know you're not a politician, but that's a messaging nightmare. I mean, why? Why?
Yeah, um, it's very frustrating. So one of the stories that I did was looking at the Biden-Harris administration um, passed landmark legislation to address the climate crisis. And the
Hmm.
focus that it did was basically spending to speed up the transition as much as
Yeah.
possible to renewables. And part of that was $600 billion with a B, the most money ever spent in US history, on environmental justice, which was ensuring that 40% of the trillions, $2 trillion that was being spent on this process was directed towards environmental justice communities, low income communities of color
Hmm.
that have been the hardest hit. So
Yeah.
that is $600 billion. And that money was also to get on the ground to help social justice organizations that do the day-to-day work every day of trying to help communities, transition communities, support them, to get them money so that they could
Hmm.
be, in some ways, their own regulators, to oversee the companies near them, to support their communities. And that is a historic, not only investment, but tactic of
Hmm.
using the federal government to support local communities that are often in struggle with their state government sometimes, which is more conservative, or the
Yeah.
companies near them, or they're not getting enough from the federal government in terms of action. So to empower them with resources. And that was because the Biden administration also brought in real activists, I would say, who worked in many levels of the government, who came out of social justice organizing, went to work in the Biden administration, and put in place policies that were really or tried to what they were doing beforehand. And then now they were helping the federal government continue with that work. And that work on equity and justice and environmental justice was basically just getting underway. That money was just getting out the door.
Mm.
And I did this story, thank you for recognizing it, of going to North Carolina and trying to see like what was happening on the ground. How was that money starting to get spent? Who would it be helping? And it was really meeting the targets that it needed to do. And what Trump has said, in addition to saying that he's going to end the key policies that Biden and Harris put into place, is defund them and is
Mm.
going to try to not only stop money that Congress has already appropriated, which is entirely unconstitutional against the law,
Yep.
but try and take it back, literally try and
Mm.
pull back that money. So we'll see, you know, what happens with that. But that's, one of the things that these guys within the Trump administration really dislike
Mm.
is diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
They don't like diversity, they don't like equity, they don't like inclusion, and they don't like policies that support those priorities. And there is a white nationalist element within this administration, and they're implementing it with policy.
Yeah, I mean Pete Hegseth, the new head of the Department of Defense, just said on Fox News this week, "We are not about diversity," which the kind of the U.S. military said, "Our diversity is our strength as a country. Is our diversity is our strength," and they're actively now just embracing the fact that that is not what we want to stand by as a country that's meant to be the old melting pot metaphor and all of those things is all of a sudden, yeah, it's our strength, but as long as it's white. Um, these people though that you talk to in North Carolina, the fact that they're getting this support and hopefully helping them, but then they're voting against their interests. I mean, do you see that there wasn't a recognition of the work that was the support that was coming to them from a Biden-Harris government, or was it, I mean, do they not understand? How do they not see the correlation between here's people who are helping you and here's someone who's done nothing to help you?
The people I
The
interviewed were not voting for Donald Trump. So no one I interviewed, I mean, I didn't choose them because they weren't, but nobody I
Yeah,
interviewed said, and by the way, I'm voting for Donald Trump. I would have been pretty shocked. I don't know how they voted, but I would be pretty shocked if that's
yeah,
how they voted. So I think the thing to say though is, so Trump won a plurality, but lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Americans didn't vote for Donald Trump. And I think
yeah.
that's really important. He was elected, but not by a landslide by any means.
Mm,
And he did convince a lot of people to vote for him. But I think it's important that there isn't Americans
mm,
cannot be defined by the plurality of voters that voted for Donald Trump. That's not
yeah.
who we are as a nation. And I don't think people should be defined by their political leaders. And I think I'm just saying that because I think lots of us have forgotten that too, that somehow now
Mm,
this defines us. Trump
yeah.
defines us. The plurality of voters that voted for him define us. They don't. The resistance defines us because the
Mm,
resistance is alive and well as well. And the rest of us don't disappear because a plurality of people elected one person president. That's quite an alliteration. Um, and but so why? So why did some people vote against their interests?
their lives in this case, because their homes, their everything that they have, which is wiped out by these worse and worse storms that are happening more and more and impacting some of the poorest states.
Yeah, how did he win North Carolina? I think we're still, there's still lots of polling that's still happening.
Yeah.
People said they voted for pocketbook issues, like your friend. They
Uh,
believed that Trump would help them economically, and they were suffering economically. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I think we're still in the process of doing it. But one is,
mm,
based on Trump's policies, what he was proposing and what he's already delivered, it's, I think, illogical to assume that he was actually going to put forward policies that were really going to help pocketbook people. Let's people's pocketbooks, average people's
Yeah.
pocketbooks. Let's look at the tax plan, most importantly, the tax plan that he passed in 2017, which has significantly increased economic inequality within the United States, both in in absolute terms and within different groups, including people of color, women, um, and has shifted even more. U.S. is already deeply, economically unequal, but shifted even more to the already extremely wealthy and the leading corporations, including the fossil fuel industry. And now his big policy plan, the one he's really most interested in, I think a lot of the stuff that he's doing is to keep us from looking at legislation, which is executive orders are
Mm.
one thing, but they can just be overturned by the next president, right? Which is
Yeah.
what he did to Biden's. Policy is much harder to change. And he has a
Mm.
very aggressive policy agenda. The most important piece for him, taxes. So he wants to
Yeah.
he wants to lower the corporate tax rate even further. And
Mm.
he wants to lower taxes on the wealthy even further and shift even more of the economic burden onto low income, middle income people. So that means
Yeah.
your person who says that they're voting from a pocketbook issue is just wrong, really, with the policies that he's going to put forward. And I think we knew that. So why did that happen? I think the question is if people were concerned about the economy, there to me had to have been a level of why did they trust Trump more than Vice President Kamala Harris?
Yeah.
What makes people trust someone like Trump more than someone like Kamala Harris? And I think there's no way to look at that question and not bring racism and sexism into the equation. So even if
Mm.
someone says to a pollster, it's about the economy,
Yeah.
there's other things going on with that person within themselves that they may not be being honest about, with the pollster that they may not be being honest about, or even just what does, again, you may be being very true that it's about the
Mm.
economy. I believe you. People are struggling. But why do you trust Trump more than Harris?
Yeah.
And to me, there just has to be a piece of that that's about racism and sexism. That's very important to talk about. And Vice President Harris had detailed economic plans, detailed policies. She had a lifelong record of work in public service that could be looked at and analyzed. And yet people would still say, she doesn't have a plan. What is her plan?
Yeah.
That was just like the same thing happened to Clinton when she ran. That
Yeah.
woman had more policies than anyone, I swear, and a longer record of policies, whether you agreed with them or not. It was
Yeah.
incredibly predictable how she would vote on any policy or what policies she would implement. Yet she was continuously criticized for not having policies. And then this exact same thing happened with Vice President Harris.
Yeah.
To me, that's upset sexism. That's
Oh
like, do you
yeah.
listen
I
to what
mean,
women say or not?
well, going back to Hillary, because Hillary had some, charismatic issues, whatever, she's telegenic and so on. But the thing is, she'd been in public life for so long, and the barriers that she broke through, and then seeing young women that were, I don't know if they're millennials or what they are, but say, oh, well, I just really like her. I'm not going to vote for her. I'm like, do you realize that she is one of the reasons why you have so many of the freedoms and rights? Like women like her in that generation. But we can't go back to that. Anyway, um, because I think this is the thing that it's just like what you've said about your environmental justice work and how it's helping these communities and then grassroots and changing. It just makes so much sense. And I guess maybe it's just all of these ideas are so hard to convey, versus you've got drill baby drill, and it's just because it's so hard to be thoughtful and articulate, and then windmills are ugly, you know, I guess is that the bane of your existence, is you're reporting on these issues and trying to translate like real change and how it helps people?
Majority of Americans are deeply concerned about the climate crisis and want to see policy that affects it, which is why
Hmm.
Biden was able to do what he was able to do.
Yeah.
So what I think happened in the election, and again, this is still something that just we need to study even more. So these are
Hmm.
initial thoughts. As I think there was a tremendous amount of intentional disinformation. And
Oh
I
yeah.
think that people were fed. I mean, so one thing I know for certain is that the fossil fuel industry and the petrochemical industry and the chemical industry spent a lot of money on advertisements that made people concerned about electronic vehicles, EV vehicles,
Mm, yeah.
and that Biden was trying to push EVs or Harris was trying to push EVs, and Trump was going to bring us back to gasoline. And the rules that they were talking about were something called CAFE standards, which are standards about fuel efficiency for automobiles. Um, the disinformation about that one topic, but it kept coming up over and over and
Mm,
over again, was bizarre and profound, but it was an onslaught of information that went into people's social media feeds, into very well targeted information. And so people are worried about the economy, and they're like, well, I guess
mm,
it messes up again my gas bill if you're trying to push EVs, so I don't want that.
yeah.
Um, and that's a sustained, well-funded disinformation campaign that worked. And because
Mm,
people's media, of course, is so siloed right now
yeah.
and getting worse, you can be within a tight media bubble that you don't get out of, right? And when I
Yeah.
was in North Carolina, one of the things I like to do when I'm on reporting
Mm,
trips is just listen to the local radio stations in that area and
yeah.
try and stay within the local sort of news space. And it was all ultra conservative radio primarily.
Yeah.
And I could sort of see how, if that's all you're listening to all day long, it wasn't people screaming and yelling, it was people
Yeah.
providing news, but providing news from a disinformed and disinformation um, uh, perspective and goal. And it could be very seductive because it was also very sort of reductionist, and here are simple solutions, and those simple solutions will come from Trump. And that was the continuous message. And, you know, I think if that's all that you were getting,
Mm,
it was persuasive, um, obviously. But I think people got conned. I mean, you know, just to say it simply,
yeah.
I think there was a very, very strong disinformation campaign from in a lot of ways, that was successful. And I think there was also, um, there was this big Joe Rogan moment when Donald
Mm,
Trump went on Joe Rogan and then Vice President Harris didn't.
yeah.
And to me, that summed up a lot of what was wrong, which is Joe Rogan is sexist and racist. People listen to him to
Mm,
hear his sexism and his racism.
yeah.
Um, I don't understand why anyone thought that was an audience that Vice President Harris would win, for one thing. And
Yeah.
then two, were we, the public, supposed to listen to her have to engage with a aggressively sexist and racist man because he's popular?
Yeah.
I don't think so. Um, but I think it also again just speaks to some of these problems that we're trying to suss out.
Yeah. Well, and connecting to people in their silos. I didn't think when she talked about interviewing with him and she said, well, you can come to me because I'm the vice president of fucking United States. And he said, no. I mean, I thought that she would have looked weaker if she had crawled to him, as Trump did. But, she did, I know a lot of people are going to be that's going to become the Hillary should have gone to Wisconsin one more time and kind of the narrative thing. Um, I wasn't going to ask you about this, but I thought about when you mentioned EVs, electronic vehicles. Someone who is a huge proponent of electronic vehicles is an interesting fellow. I don't know if you've heard of him. His name is Elon something Musk. Musk. Yeah. So Elon Musk, he's obviously he was the guy apparently that invented the electronic car, which I know is not true, but he's a huckster as well. But you would think he'd have a vested interest in supporting people who believe in electronic vehicles versus now aligning himself with the guy who's in the pocket of big oil. What? I mean, do you have any kind of thoughts on any rationality for Elon Musk, if there is such a thing that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, of course, again, like just on this on the list of things that have been very, very difficult in the last, 2 weeks, at a post-inaugural event, standing at a podium at a formal
Yeah.
post-inauguration event, at a podium with the seal of the president in front of him, Elon Musk making what any sane, rational person
Mhm.
would know to be a Nazi salute, still cannot be normalized and cannot fall out of our dialogue because
Yeah.
it's there's already been so much else that has already sort of been like, oh, okay, well, that happened. I guess we just keep
Mhm.
going. And I had hoped that that would mean that he wouldn't be invited to be a part of that public, space anymore, and that didn't happen.
Yeah.
He's still, very committed to being a part of this administration and to running the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. Um, so, he has certainly decided that it is in his interests to remain a part of the Trump administration in whatever way that means, whether he's the person with the influence or, Trump is, who knows. You know, Musk has a lot of money to make that isn't really going to be impacted that much on the thing that again, this is where it's disinformation. This thing called the
Mm.
CAFE standard isn't really about shifting to EVs or not. It's about regulating the efficiency of automobiles and reducing the pollution that comes from them.
Mm.
It makes them more
Right.
efficient to users. Um, some cars will benefit, some car makers will benefit if they increase their EV fleet. And there were
Mm.
certainly tax advantages and investment that was being made by the Biden administration to help increase the efficiency and use of electronic vehicles, but nothing that was going to, um, like dramatically. Like there are things that were very much going to help the electronic vehicle market, which
Mm.
Elon Musk would benefit from. The
Yeah.
things that Trump is undoing aren't going to kill the EV market. I guess that's what I'm trying
Right.
to say. um,
Okay.
uh, and Musk will still be able to make money from his EVs. But I think way more importantly for Musk on the sort of list that the Trump administration has advantages to him, one is certainly the tax bill. Again, the tax bill is even bigger.
Mm.
That's going to make Musk trillions of dollars if the tax bill gets through. And
Right.
then, overall, I assume that, his position of influence over over the US government will reap him larger rewards than the, sort of shifts from the subsidies to EVs is going to cost him. But who knows? Maybe
Yeah.
he's just nuts. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's only so much. I mean, he makes he's the world's richest man, so you can only
Exactly.
become more of the world's richest man, but that doesn't give you power. And I suppose having the Trump as your puppet, that gives you power, and that seems to be what he wants. I- it is fascinating because you would think the people who would want to buy Teslas would not be the people, that his market, the right wing guy out in wherever with their Trump. I haven't seen any Trump trucks that were Tesla trucks with the mega banners on them because those two things don't seem to go together. You want a gas guzzler and you want your mega sticker, not an EV and a mega sticker. Maybe that will
I,
change.
yeah, I don't know. I think, so for me, the transition is much more should be even more guided by investments
Mm,
in things like public transportation, walkable cities, things that move us out of cars as much as possible.
yeah.
Still, the vast majority of the world still lives in cities. If cities are made much more accessible and efficient and easy to live in and move around in and have public transportation and things you can walk to, that's going to dramatically reduce the use of cars, period.
Mm,
And reducing the use of cars, period, will reduce all of the inputs that need to go into them, including for electronic vehicles, things like the batteries and the resource extraction that needs to go into them. I'd love to limit that too. So basically, the less that we're extracting, the better.
yeah.
And the more that we're living cleaner, healthy, movable lives, the better. So I'm a particular advocate of everything that gets us out of cars as
Mm,
much as we can. Of course, we're going to still have cars, we're going to still have trucks, we're still going to have planes, and moving into EVs is great for that. But we want to reduce that as much as possible.
mm,
And that was part of the investments that the Biden-Harris administration were making as well.
yeah. Um, I've taken up more of your time than I promised, so I want to finish on this. So thank you so much. It's been really fascinating talking to you. So I guess as sort of a journalist and an investigative type journalist, what do you see, at least in the short term? It's hard to know what Trump will do next, but what are you looking at reporting on going forward?
It's two pieces, basically trying to stay on top of what the Trump administration is doing, what it
Mm,
means, and what the impacts would be. So trying to one sort of head it off at the pass, get that information out there, help people, elected officials, the public organizations know how to respond by having that information. And then reporting on what I call the resistance,
yeah,
what people are still doing. There's still climate organizing. There's still environmental justice organizing. There's an entire world out there of people who are still committed to addressing the climate crisis, and trying to continue to elevate those voices and that work,
mm,
and do our best to also not let the harms of the um, Trump White House harm harm as much reduce those harms as much as possible, but also try and keep them from radiating outside of the United States as much as possible too.
yeah.
So yeah, th those are the two sort of key goals of my journalism moving forward.
Hmm. Well, I look forward to seeing that as we go forward, and it'd be great to touch base with you again another time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. So there we have it. Antonia Juhas. Thank you so much to her for coming on the podcast. Thank you, as always, to Mark, the producer, for putting everything together. Please make sure to check out her writing on Rolling Stone and in other places. I'm going to put her Blue Sky link in the description as well. That's where it's all happening, kids. Blue Sky is it, man. We're leaving the old Musky Musk Twitter. And yeah, thank you. It was such an interesting conversation. I learned a lot about environmental justice, and the work that's being done there and the work that was done by the Biden administration, which, as somebody who's a avowed Democrat and pays attention to a lot of things I didn't know about and I learned. And the challenge of getting the message out there is never, ever ending. So thank you so much to Antonia again. Check her out as well. Check out the previous podcast. Subscribe to the channel. Like us. Send me roses. I don't know. Do whatever you feel is necessary. But join us again next week. But thank you very much. See you next time. Bye bye.